For over 2 decades, the theatrical cuts of the wizarding world have dictated global pop culture, shaping the collective memory of an entire generation. But beneath the flashing cinematic special effects and the grand orchestral scores lies a massive corporate web of narrative cover-ups, omitted plot histories, and systematic character executions. Welcome to the Potter Audit. This platform does not exist to celebrate Hollywood hype, nor does it operate on casual movie nostalgia. This is an independent forensic review of the original literary text canon. As our systematic countdown to the winter production parameters narrows, our single objective is absolute factual reconstruction. We are dissecting the vital rules, dark philosophies, and gritty realities that Warner Brothers was too afraid to film. The forensic files are officially open. The audit begins now. Unsealing this secondary archive demands an immediate bypass of the carefully curated propaganda issued by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The mainstream historical ledger routinely presents the island fortress of Azkaban as a necessary post-statute of secrecy innovation, a legal shield engineered exclusively to safeguard civilian society from high-threat magical actors. This bureaucratic framing remains an intentional distortion of the text. A forensic audit of the baseline historical timeline reveals that the Ministry of Magic did not construct this architectural anomaly to serve the interests of public safety or criminal rehabilitation. Rather, the political executive uncovered an existing site of historical mass murder and made a calculated, cynical choice to weaponize its inherent horrors. By cross-examining the raw, unfiltered book canon, we expose how a democratic wizarding state came to depend entirely on an ancient, unplottable coordinate to enforce its state authority, initiating a dark partnership with things that never should have been given legal recognition. This dark partnership traces its lineage directly back to the dark archaeological record of the 15th century, long before the International Statute of Secrecy was codified in 1692. During this primitive era, the island coordinate was the private domain of a rogue sorcerer known in ancient hidden journals only as Ekrizdis. The literary canon establishes that this individual practiced dark magic of the worst and most unstable kind, specifically manipulating the fabric of human souls through prolonged torment. The fortress walls were intentionally engineered with spatial anomalies, meant to lure, trap, and experiment upon unsuspecting Muggle sailors navigating the North Sea. For decades, this geographic blind spot functioned as an industrial slaughterhouse, completely insulated from external scrutiny. When Ekrizdis finally died, and his powerful concealment charms naturally decayed, Ministry investigators discovered a creative architecture so thoroughly saturated with agony that the local environment had completely warped, inheriting not a building, but a localized monument to human degradation. The residual horror of that human degradation eventually triggered an unprecedented biological phenomenon within the windowless lower levels of the keep. The text establishes that Dementors are not natural sentient creatures, nor do they occupy a recognized branch within the magical evolutionary ecosystem. They are non-being anomalies spawned directly by the process of abiogenesis, specifically generated by the sheer density of decay, despair, and death left behind by Ekrizdis' slaughtered victims. They do not mate. They multiply like a toxic, parasitic fungus, wherever conditions of absolute misery are systematically maintained. When the first Ministry containment teams finally breached the heavy iron thresholds, they encountered an interior completely infested with hundreds of these sightless, rotting entities. The government immediately faced an existential administrative crisis, realizing that any conventional attempt to banish or destroy the swarm could cause them to scatter across the British mainland, creating a permanent national emergency of mass psychic rot. Faced with this permanent threat of domestic contamination, Minister for Magic Damocles Roll implemented a terrifying bureaucratic mandate in 1718 that would forever alter the ethical baseline of the state. Rather than sealing the coordinate or dedicating massive financial resources to an endless military quarantine, Roll recognized a brilliant, twisted utility in the island's unique population. The growing wizarding population urgently required a maximum security penitentiary to isolate high-risk criminals following the implementation of the Statute of Secrecy. Roll calculated that by transforming the island into a national prison, the executive branch could solve two logistical crises simultaneously. The Dementors would be appeased with a steady, managed supply of human minds to drain, ensuring they remained permanently anchored to the C coordinate. In return, these entities would serve the ministry as an unpaid, unbribable, and completely inescapable security force, codifying state-sanctioned torture under the guise of fiscal pragmatism. This calculated fiscal pragmatism translated directly into a system of slow, state-orchestrated mental obliteration for every inmate entering the system. The original literary text canon describes a penal reality where inmates were not merely confined by physical bars, but systematically stripped of their cognitive core. Because Dementors survive exclusively by absorbing positive human memory data, prisoners were forced to relive their most agonizing personal traumas on a continuous loop. Within weeks of incarceration, subjects routinely lost the capacity for coherent speech. Within months, their underlying magical cores deteriorated entirely. While the ministry's public relations apparatus continuously framed the island as a triumph of judicial deterrence, the internal institutional precedent was far more sinister. Azkaban operated effectively as a metabolic meat grinder, using the minds of low-level offenders and political scapegoats alike as raw fuel to feed the state's monstrous, homegrown border guards. This horrific system of cognitive extraction survived for centuries because it existed within a complete legal void, entirely unburdened by standard judicial oversight. Under ministry protocol, the executive branch possessed the unilateral authority to condemn citizens to this psychic death trap without a formal trial or evidentiary review. The case of Sirius Black stands as a definitive institutional indictment. He was transferred directly to the fortress by Barty Crouch Sr. during a state of wartime panic, completely bypassing the Council of Magical Law. This complete dismantling of due process reveals that the wizarding world's legal infrastructure was built upon a fragile foundation of political convenience. The upcoming 2026 HBO series faces a critical creative mandate to restore this administrative ruthlessness, exposing how easily a seemingly civilized society can collapse into state-sanctioned terror when its constitutional checks and balances are entirely removed to preserve public order. When subjects did manage to survive this absolute absence of justice, the long-term psychological fallout provided a stark window into the permanent damage inflicted by the state. The book canon outlines the profound emotional deformation experienced by survivors, noting that the psychic trauma did not dissipate upon release or escape. Sirius Black's erratic behavior throughout The Prisoner of Azkaban and The Order of the Phoenix is not merely character eccentricity. It is a clinical depiction of severe post-traumatic stress and personality fracturing caused by a decade of forced emotional starvation. The text forces a realization that the island was never engineered to rehabilitate or correct criminal behavior. It was designed to erase identity. By analyzing these deep, permanent cognitive scars, we uncover a profound literary critique of a penal philosophy that permanently destroys the human soul to maintain a superficial illusion of absolute domestic control. This deep institutional deformity survived well into the modern era, remaining completely untouched by the heavily publicized reforms of the post-war government. Following the fall of Voldemort in 1998, Minister Kingsley Shacklebolt famously announced the permanent removal of all Dementors from the state penal service, deploying rotating units of elite Aurors to guard the perimeter instead. While the mainstream press celebrated this shift as a progressive triumph of human rights, a forensic cross-examination of the operational reality reveals a deeply flawed compromise. The physical fortress itself, deeply saturated by centuries of human torment and black magic, remained fully functional as the state's premier lockup. The ministry merely substituted the visible horror of non-being entities with human law enforcement assets, forcing its own officers to absorb the residual psychological decay of a psychically poisoned coordinate, demonstrating that superficial political updates often mask a total failure to uproot systemic evil. This systemic sanitization of the narrative layout extends past the fictional ministry directly into the real-world corporate production pipelines of Warner Brothers. In director Alfonso Cuarón's 2004 cinematic translation of The Prisoner of Azkaban, the deep, dark historical architecture of the island was entirely excised to prioritize a fast-paced, mainstream theatrical runtime. Production logs reveal that the corporate decision to present Dementors as weightless, floating cloth ghosts, rather than the physical, rotting, scabbed humanoids explicitly described by J.K. Rowling, drastically minimized the body horror inherent to the text. By omitting the legacy of Ekrizdis and the state's deep economic dependency on these non-beings, the studio compressed a highly sophisticated critique of government corruption into a simplified, family-friendly story of good wizards against scary monsters, actively shielding mass audiences from the true intellectual depth of the source material. The lingering consequence of this corporate mitigation is a global fandom largely unaware of how the wizarding world's architecture dictates its destiny. The text demands we recognize that an authoritarian apparatus, once constructed and normalized by the state, continues to exert a dark, inescapable gravity over society long after its initial operators have been removed from office. Azkaban stands not as a monument to justice, but as an unsettling proof of what a democratic governance is willing to tolerate, legitimize, and feed to maintain its comfortable public relations cycle. As the production parameters for the 2026 television adaptation materialize, the creative staff faces a monumental opportunity to finally reject the softened Hollywood filters of the past, restoring the raw political horror of this dark coordinate. This analytical history remains locked in the text, awaiting a reconstruction that refuses to turn a blind eye to the monstrosities hiding directly behind the state seal. The forensic files for this specific case study are officially closed, but our systematic countdown to the winter launch continues to accelerate. The historical text canon holds thousands of hidden secrets, structural plot holes, and corporate alterations that must be brought into the light before the cameras roll. To secure your administrative clearance for our upcoming weekly intelligence briefings, tap the subscribe button on your screen right now. Ensure you explore our archive of daily shorts to trace the complete, unbroken timeline of movie alterations. Do not let Hollywood dictate the boundaries of your law. Stay vigilant. The audit never sleeps.